Hello and welcome to the latest Lace Partners webinar. My name is Chris Howard and I'm the Marketing Director at Lace Partners, and I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us today. We've run a number of these webinars now. We'll continue to run these webinars because we're quite enjoying them quite a lot. And today's webinar is on how HR can get the digital employee experience right. I'm going to introduce the speakers and panelists today in just a second, but just before I do that, you know the drill by now. It's the usual sort of housekeeping. So this is, as you've probably seen, a go-to webinar platform, and that comes with the fabulous functionality of chat. Whilst you can't talk straight at us, you can drop a note into the chat functionality. And with that in mind, let's test that it's actually working and that I'm not talking to myself, because I do that enough at home alone staring at the wall. So can you just pop into your chat functionality, hello? Let's say your favorite day of the week. If someone can give me their favorite day of the week, that'd be great. Am I talking to myself? Let's see. We will soon find out. Saturday. I've got a Saturday straight away. Brilliant. Right. Okay, so it looks like it's working, and a thank you to Samantha, Emma, Melanie, Kevin, John, Charles, Martin, Rachel, Steve, Martin, Rod, Kerry. Thank you all for joining us. Another Sarah in there as well. So as you can tell, this is the chat functionality. This is a Q&A session. We want this to be as interactive as we can possibly make it, even though you can't talk to us. So if you do have any questions, then please feel free to pop them into that box at any stage. I will be monitoring throughout. And then if we get time, we should get time, normally 5-10 minutes at the end, then we will be able to go through the questions. And if we don't, a little bit of sort of post-webinar feedback for you. We will have this webinar recorded. So this is being recorded right now, and that will go up on our website, which is lacepartners.co.uk/webinars. So you'll be able to access that. You'll also be sent an email after this event too. We will also put together an FAQs document. We've done that for the last couple of webinars, where we just put together a Word document which has some of the answers to some of the questions that you ask as well. So if we don't get through to everything today, then we will endeavour to do our best to get through. But as usual, I've talked for far too long, and it's time to introduce the talent for today's webinar. So Aaron, I'm going to hand across to you, who's going to introduce the real talent.
Thanks, Chris, as always. Excellent introduction. Welcome, everyone. Great to see some of you back as well. And for those who have not been with us before, welcome. Really excited to do today's webinar focused around employee experience. I'm the Managing Director and Co-Founder at Lace Partners. And today I'm going to join into the discussion as we go through. For those of you who joined previous webinars, we focused our efforts over the last few around sort of COVID and COVID-19 and the 12-step plan that we put together to help HR functions and HR directors map through all of the transition out of the office, the engagement during lockdown, and then transition back to whatever the new normal is for your organization. And we spent quite a lot of time talking around the various parts of that 12-step model. And I think as we move into these series of webinars where we start picking up on other things, I think we can't leave behind that legacy. Clearly, it's impacted all of us and impacted all of our roles and the way in which our businesses operate and work. And so as we look at employee experience, one of the things I know we'll talk about today is how COVID-19 and the lockdown has forever probably changed employee experience and the way in which people engage with their colleagues and the way in which people experience businesses now as they join. And I'm joined today by two great panelists, Luca Winterborn from Centrica. I met Luca a couple of years ago, actually, at the Employee Experience Awards. We were both judges there. That was an exciting time. We clearly were excited by the work. Then we kept in touch and been really keen to understand how Luca has taken forward that role as the global HR experience lead at Centrica. So you're going to hear a lot about that today and his experiences, thoughts on what is good employee experience and some of the things that are being put in place within his organization, but also what he's seen as well through some of that as well. So I'll let Luca introduce himself in a bit more detail. I'm also joined by my colleague Emma Leonis, who some of you will have seen on other webinars and podcasts with us before. Emma is our executive director responsible for HR transformation, but also employee experience. Very passionate in this space, I know, Em. I know you're going to talk a little bit about some of the research you've also been doing in this space as well with a number of organizations and bringing their thoughts together. So I think we should probably get underway. I'm going to hand over to Emma, and she's going to compare us through the discussion, and we're going to join in as we go. Emma.
Thanks, Aaron, and lovely to have all of you on the line join us today. Just, I guess, from my point of view, maybe if I share sort of a couple of things that particularly interest me about employee experience, and then Luca will share our combined experiences together. So I suppose it's one of those things, employee experience, that we've been talking about as HR for quite a long time now. It has become a little bit of a buzzword, not in a bad way, but a little bit of a buzzword. And for me, I think it's really about how we design outcomes and what that means for the overall operating model for HR, but not just for employees, but line managers, business leaders. And it's something that I, as Aaron has mentioned, explored a little bit in some recent research that we've been doing. So I spoke to 25 different global directors of HR shared services in particular, as typically HR shared services tends to be at the heart of the day-to-day experience of employees and colleagues in organisations. And every single one of them said, this has to be our North Star. It's our reason for existing. But interestingly, and perhaps we'll explore a little bit why this is the case, less than half of them actually measured employee experience. So 48% of them said they did have some measures around employee experience. They kind of knew what their moments that mattered were, but they weren't necessarily focusing on the outcomes and continued improvement and success around that. So that is quite an interesting thing for me, in the kind of, there's obviously an opportunity for us to continue to do more. And I think perhaps the recent kind of couple of months that we've all been through, which has clearly been challenging, I think has probably expedited the need for even more focus now on digital, but also thinking about those different personas that we have in organisations. And around 54% of the organisations that I spoke to in that research, because I went back to them post-COVID, said that the recent months have actually expedited their need for them to further invest in service delivery technology, for example. So the likes of knowledge management, AI, chatbots, etc. So really keen, Luca, as sort of we chat together to get some of your perspectives on what you're seeing in your own experience and slightly broader. But before we do that, maybe, Luca, just if you could tell us a little bit around sort of yourself and your passion, I guess, in this space, that'd be great.
My journey, I guess, it's been quite a unique one. So I've had a bit of a privileged kind of few years, I guess, having been involved in employee experience about 5 years now. So I started off, my background is HR, then shifting into employee communications, leadership communications and engagement and culture, and then moving into the HR operational space. And it was from there really that we at Centrica evolved our thinking around employee experience, driven by the need to know who our employees were, know what their wants, needs and desires were of interacting with HR in the organisation, and then improving all those key moments that matters for our people. So all the way from talent acquisition and how you join the organisation, all the way through to how you leave, everything that sits in between typically is led or owned in most cases by us, by HR. So we have a responsibility to, I guess, continuously improve all of those key moments that matter. And from that HR operational lens, I say about 5 years ago now, it seems like a lot longer, we've developed a very, very targeted approach on employee experience at Centrica. And I think, I'm seeing that happening across the marketplace, perhaps not to the extent that I've been involved in as at Centrica, but I think, a lot of us on the phone today are thinking about employee experience more and more, and it's really encouraging to kind of see that trend take off. Again, expedited, I think, currently by COVID massively, and we sort of explore that in a bit further. But yeah, that's sort of my background and passion into the X as it evolves.
Thanks, Luca. So perhaps maybe if we start with a sort of broad question around your experience of what the principles are for employee experience, because you've got to start somewhere and therefore kind of design around that.
You really do. You've got to start somewhere, and so for me, personally and professionally, EX is something that's driven by colleagues. It's not something that's driven by organisations and by us as a HR function. So at Centrica, we use a 4D methodology, which is, for any of those on the call who have a process design background, it's basically discover, define, develop, and deploy. And all stages of those 4Ds are done with employee involvement and interaction. But if we wind the clock right back, we had to set out some design principles for employee experience way back sort of Q4 2018. And we did that with employee involvement and interaction through a range of workshops, group sessions, one-to-one interviews, etc. And what the feedback we heard was that our employees wanted principles that enabled the best experience for them. So with that in mind, we settled on 5 key principles. So the first one was people focused. So employees are always central to our decision making as an organization, and we can and will continue to collaborate with them to design experiences that suit them and build ongoing trust. Our second principle was strive to be adaptive and agile, which I think is never more so important than currently. So we'll enable services to be upgradable where possible, strive to continuously improve, etc. Our third one was power to self-serve. Again, enormously pertinent in the current climate. COVID's just sort of expedited that transition. But we want to help our people to serve themselves through tools that work with human interaction in the moments that matter where necessary. You know, the example I always use for that is you can automate everything, but there has to be a balance. Not everything can be automated, and I know AI tech is a huge big thing on the marketplace at the moment. Let's get a chatbot for this, a process for that, and automate everything. Well, I always use the example of the death in service from a HR lens. You know, the worst possible experience you can imagine is having to deal with a chatbot in that situation. I know it's an extreme situation, but I think it's the best possible example that we can use. Our fourth principle was enabled by data. So the foundation of employee experience for me is colleague insight. You know, I said earlier on, employee experience is not something that can be ideated in a corporate office, in a boardroom. It has to be driven by insights from employees directly. However we choose to get those insights, we use surveys at Centrica and Pulse. We also interview and hold workshops to get the true employee voice through. And the final principle that was ideated was simplicity. So our continuous goal to make the complex simple for our people. And the beauty of these 5 principles are that as I said at the start, that they're purely driven by employee insights. So it wasn't a case of, you know, this is what we think is going to work best for Centrica. You tell us what you want from us as a HR function.
That's fantastic, Luca. And I think that sort of point around the different journeys, the different experiences that everyone has kind of resonates with some of the conversations that I had with each of the participants in the research, and that ultimately I think now we're moving towards more of a scenario of people wanting contact their way.
Yeah.
So it's everyone, there are definitely parallels across experiences, but everyone is also unique. So rather than trying to push just one way of doing things, it's about how you balance, I guess, that standardization and personalization to get the blended experience that you're looking for. And also not just to always focus on employees, because clearly there are other different populations in the business, like the line managers and the business leadership, which perhaps we'll come on to that in a moment, because they tend to get a little bit, I think, forgotten sometimes. So thinking about perhaps all of that kind of work that you did, when you did the design, did anything come up as particularly unexpected? Did it throw up any interesting insights for you?
So I guess the foremost thing is for us all to remember is that employees love to have their opinions heard. And if we can't provide the mechanisms to do that, it quite often leads to a culture of distrust and disengagement. So, and I don't know about any of you guys on the phone, etc., but I've seen time and time again organisations do an annual pulse survey, employee engagement survey, what have you. There's a big hoo-ha about it. It's a big song and dance. It goes out once a year, and then employees see very little off the back of it, and therefore that culture of distrust starts to creep in leadership. So employees love to have their voices heard and then to see results enacted off the back of their feedback. So that was the first key learning, was that everyone that we involved in our listening mechanisms loved being involved. So whatever opportunity you can give to colleagues to get involved, I would absolutely advocate that. But then you have to do something off the back of it. You can't just take the insights in and do nothing, and that zero change. I think what some of the other learnings that we gathered were around, you know, HR. I think in many organisations designs processes and designs journeys in a way that HR thinks is the right way to do it. Now, that's not necessarily the wrong thing to do. Some of it's very technical, but we often forget to use tone of voice. We often forget to use language or design processes that are simplistic for employees to follow. And you know, a lot of us have a single HRIS system in place. You know, at Centrica, we use Workday for everything. But if you're a line manager who only has to do a hire or a job change once a year, that process can seem quite daunting. So getting the employee insights to make these journeys as simple as possible in the tone of voice and the language that employees use was a really big shift change for us as a HR function. So we continuously now build Workday to better align to what our employees want and need from it.
And have you, sort of thinking about that power to self-serve principle, Luca, particularly enabled certain parts of journeys, obviously through digitalisation? You mentioned Workday is your core HRS, you use it for everything. Yep. So talk to me a little bit more about how you digitise, I guess, key moments.
So we actually hit a bit of a landmark at Centrica a year ago, where we could confidently say that all of our people processes were in Workday. And that was a really big step to get everything in one place, to then drive that self-serve. The key challenge from there on has been to enable that self-serve to happen. You know, so there's a lot around colleague education, line manager support and upskilling that we continuously do to ensure that self-serve can be optimised by our colleagues. So as I say, everything now sits within Workday, including, for example, learning and development. So you access all of your learning courses and your packages and training through Workday. So yeah, we're in a pretty fortunate position that it's all in one place now. But that does lead to separate challenges, as you've touched upon earlier, Emma, around unique journeys for line managers versus colleagues, and what does that all look like? We as well, I guess, like many other organisations, have a huge raft of data on our intranet. So how do you then help employees navigate vast intranets to get to the information that they need quickly, and in as few clicks as possible? So that, I mean, some of the struggles that these are continuous struggles that we have to work around. But it's a big step for Centrica was having that entire life cycle in Workday and reaching that goal.
I think it's interesting, Emma. Sorry, Luca, just you're talking there about the process you went through, and I'm just thinking about some of the people on the webinar listening in. This can feel like quite a daunting first step to take, right? I mean, we've spent years rationalizing HR processes, standardizing them, making them as efficient as possible for the HR population to be as low cost as possible in a lot of organizations. And this switch to opening it up, to actually opening yourself up to feedback, to taking that first step, can be really quite a challenging one. I'm just interested to see, you touched on one thing there, which was be ready to do something about it when you do start listening. Any other things you'd say to people who are just thinking about starting this journey and changing?
I mean, there's no doubt about it, Aaron. It's an enormously brave step, and there needs to be, you need to come to your own conclusions in your organisation. And everyone's situations are unique. But if you embark on this journey, you've got to be fully committed to follow it through. But it's not a bad thing to do. So just to be clear, let's take a look at the outside market. We're all e-shoppers. More so now than ever before, we expect a high level of service. We expect things instantly. We expect seamless service and seamless design. and for companies like eBay and Amazon to do what they say on the tin, full stop. Now, HR, you could look at having a bit of a monopoly in most organizations because employees have no other option but to be customers of the service you provide. But that certainly doesn't mean that the service that you do provide should be any less than the highest of expectations.
Yeah.
Of course, there are other factors such as monetary restraints and cost to serve, etc., which everyone needs to take into account, of course. But that still means that you can provide the best service using colleague insight and data to help shape and design that. I think, and what you find 9 times out of 10 is what we found at Centrica, and in my external network as well of VX professionals, is that what employees want isn't vastly different to what the organisation wants. You know, every organisation wants an inclusive, seamless culture where there's trust, and employees want to stay. They don't want to look for the next opportunity externally and jump ship. They want to stay with the organisation. And employees want the same thing. So by involving employees, it's a win-win all round. That's what I found both in my current role and again, as I've said, within my network externally. The employee insight is it's just got to be the foundation of the way forward.
I think I'd probably add to that, Aaron, if I may, just in terms of 2 observations from me would be, there's something around being transparent. So Luca, you know, you talked about if you ask for opinions, you've got to act on them. But I think there's also an element of saying what you will and won't do and kind of phasing that timing and being honest. Because you can't fix everything in one go at all. I wish we could, but we can't do that, can't wave a magic wand. And I suppose there's also something around reinforcing positives through that journey too. So we often focus on the things that are broken, understandably, because that tends to be what gets moaned about the most and causes the most noise. But we do a lot of good things as well. So balancing those 2, I think, as part of that messaging is important. And also starting small. You know, we talk quite a lot, again, it's a little bit of a buzz phrase, but about being agile and flexible in HR. But I think with things like this, it is taking steps. So how can we compartmentalize parts of journeys? How can we try something? Clearly, it depends on your culture. Some cultures are more open to trying and testing and evolving than others are. They'll want a perfect solution to start with. But I'd probably add that, Aaron, into that observation as well. It's the transparency, the messaging, the cultural element of that, but then also starting small, I think, too. Which might also be why, quite interestingly, when I was just doing some of my own sort of secondary research, you know, Gartner have done quite a lot of research into employee experience, and they say that only 13% of employees in one of their surveys said that they felt fully satisfied with their experience. It's probably not that we're not doing a great job, it's probably to do with how we've communicated it, managed expectations, and our approach to delivering that, perhaps, which is quite interesting.
It's interesting, Emma, because you touched on the point there, which was about the need to give options. I think a big part about employee experience is options. You think about how you interact, and Luke, you were making this point about commercial interaction. You're interacting in different ways and different channels. Sometimes you want to do it on your phone because of where you are and your location and travel, or you may want to do it through a laptop, or you may actually want to pick up the phone every so often to your bank and have a conversation with them, right? And you need those different optionalities. And so I think there's options is part of the equation, but I think also, and it's come up as one of the questions, so I'll be interested to get your point, Luca, on this, is there's also an optionality around the type of workforce as well. I mean, every organization has a different workforce, and different workforces may want to absorb or access their experience in a different way. And you've got quite a diverse workforce in Centrica, so I'd be quite interested to understand what the kind of differences have been and whether how big an influence that's been on the experience journey you've been on.
Yeah, it's been vast. I mean, absolutely. You know, Centrica specifically has you're spot on, a really diverse workforce from office and corporate employees and group functions all the way through to engineers and British Gas and, you know, Dynarod, all those different brands that we have, all the way through to employees working on platforms in the North Sea. So yes, it's an extremely diverse workforce, and what we've had to be able to do is offer channels of interaction that work for people. So if we turn the clock back all the way again to sort of 2017, the first piece of EX work that we did was an employee segmentation exercise to identify who those, broadly speaking, employee personas were. And then through discussion and interviews, we were able to sort of discover what the pain and gain points were for those employee personas on their interaction journeys with HR, what they wanted to get out of their interactions, and what worked well and what didn't work well for them. And off all that exercise, we're then able to sort of build a more robust plan, future thinking plan, to better serve those individual personas. And it's not a case of one size fits all. You know, what's very simple for someone in group functions to do is just to log on a PC and, you know, raise a ticket for a HR query, for example. But it's far less easier for an engineer to do that, or someone in the field. So, you know, that split and that optionality has been key. But again, that's all been driven by employee insight and feedback. It's not something we've ideated in isolation.
Great. And Luca, maybe if I can build on that from a different persona standpoint. So we talk an awful lot about employees. They clearly are a massive part of every organisational workforce. But you've also then got line managers that actually have two experiences. They've got the employee experience because they're an employee, but they're also then managing teams. And I think the past few months, with COVID and everyone needing to work remotely, for example, has perhaps placed more expectations on that group now than there ever were before in terms of how they interact in the right ways with their teams to keep them engaged. And I'd just be sort of interested more generally in your perspectives on, over the past couple of years, as you've been focusing on experience, how you've perhaps helped that more leadership and kind of senior management and, you know, day-to-day team lead group, the line manager group, adapt to maybe new ways of working, expectations, etc.
Yeah, so something I hear a lot about is line manager capability. And it's always said with quite a negative tone, or like, we've got a line manager capability issue in here, or, you know, this company's got a line manager capability issue, what do we do about it? You know, they're not good enough. Well, actually, what you'll find 9 times out of 10 is that you haven't got a line manager capability issue. What the organisation is doing is asking increasingly larger amounts of line managers without them putting the mechanisms and the upskilling and the learning in place to support them to do those additional exercises that you're now requiring. So I found this internally and externally. This is, you know, a very key observation. So one of the things that we've been doing at Centrica throughout COVID and before is specifically targeting our line manager population with additional sets of learning, whether it's e-learns, whether they're, you know, workshops, whatever channel we could mobilize at pace to help line managers work remotely and support employees in an increasingly tough scenario that we've all been living for about 4 months now. Yeah. You know, and so line managers, generally speaking, want to do the best. They want to do their best for their teams and their people. So I always ask people to reflect on what mechanisms you have in place to support the line managers, rather than sort of pointing the finger and saying we've got a line manager capability issue at the start. We've been using intranet massively for our sort of COVID duration, and producing lots of little playbooks, guides, anything that we think can help line managers. And I think the difficulty is that we've got lots of people, and this will apply to not just Centrica, but lots of different organisations, who are working from home for the first time at length, and are managing people at home for the first time. And I think, you know, call centre environments specifically, where all the work's done on site, and we, like many other organisations, mobilised all of our call centres to home working environments within 2 weeks. So it's a huge, huge journey for employees. But, you know, Emma, you said something earlier on about, you know, the transparency and the trust and the communication. They've been critical, absolutely critical, in us enabling our guys to work from home effectively.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, isn't it? Just that need to just be very open as an individual, as a leader, and that comes quite naturally to some, not to others. Just being human, being relatable, but to your point, ultimately telling those individuals what you expect them to do. Because have we ever really been truly 100% transparent about what we expect our line managers to do in general? And then obviously now with this new shift in ways of working, with it being more remote, and I think that will continue. I'm sure there'll be a mix of office naturally, and remote for all of us in the future, but it's going to have different expectations, I think.
Yeah, and we were talking, weren't we, just before we started the webinar about the input. I was talking to someone the other day, which is kind of how this came up, was who's joined an organization, and quite a few people have done this, right? Joined organizations during lockdown, which I think is quite a brave step, right? Yeah, especially if you've been hired during that process, and therefore haven't met their colleagues, right? They haven't had that softer side of landing in an organization, being embraced by the culture and the ways of working. And I just, it was caught me, but it was really brought home to me how much how important the experience therefore is, and how I think it gets amplified in this new environment, in the fact that their experience of a new organization is the digital communication that they get. It's the amount of times a line manager calls them up and has a conversation that isn't necessarily work related, right? Which is all the kind of stuff you'd have done if you were in the office. Is how often a colleague in their peer group picks up the phone and has a chat to them or connects to them, and the mechanisms by which. So I think from my perspective, I was reflecting, I think there's clearly some challenges with the COVID has brought to all of us, but also in some ways it's been incredibly focusing of that employee experience approach and what you need to do. I don't know if you've seen similar, Luca.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, what a crisis like COVID has essentially done is enabled us all to hold a mirror up to ourselves as organisations and as HR professionals. And the mirror's either told us that we're doing things really, really well, or we've got vast areas that we need to improve on. All very good learning. So none of that is actually a negative. But we've certainly seen COVID give us an opportunity at Centrica to massively shift and change things in a positive direction. And let's just take communication, for example. I think lots of communications teams are kind of doing their own thing, either self-serve or partnering. But I think what I've certainly found in my career is that communication can often come across as quite disingenuous or very corporate. So one of the key learnings that we've seen out of COVID is that communication has vastly improved, because our leaders have had to step into the space of communicating directly. And therefore, those communications have been more genuine and have fostered greater levels of trust because of the transparency. So all of a sudden, we're in a space now where our communication feedback has gone through the roof. So we must try and find a way to maintain that now. But yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting journey for us all.
I'm thinking, Luca, sort of about ongoing continuous improvement. You talked, earlier on about, again, one of your design principles being experiences enabled by data. And I mentioned sort of in the introduction, I definitely echo that. And clearly we're all thinking about experience, and we're starting to think about what outcomes look like. But in my experience and my research, it's interesting to see that whilst we all understand we need to focus on outcomes, actually when push comes to shove, less than half of the organisations in our shared service research actually have explicit measures around employee experience.
Yes.
So I'd be really interested just to sort of understand, again, from your point of view, how you measure success, whether that's, with hard data points, is it a mix of that and qualitative? Are there new things? And I've got some perspectives on that too, which we can share.
So what we did, again, using COVID to our advantage, we were able to shift the way that we captured data and employee insights and sentiment. So we were of the old school camp of doing a one annual survey to our employees, and we still do that because there is still value in that. I don't disregard that. But we were then able to use COVID as a mechanism to start putting in place a very regular, structured pulse mechanism of surveys, really. And we use a system called Qualtrics, which many of you guys will be familiar with if you're not already using. If you don't have it, you can use Teams, whatever. But we put in place this regular pulse check-in, and we would change the questions, but to understand what employee sentiment was like across the organisation and what their challenges were right now, so specifically related to COVID. And we've been able to then evolve that into a far more regular pulse check process, which we will continue to do. And through that, we're able to gain insights on, how are people finding their leadership right now, and how their line managers supporting them. How is how's COVID affecting the physical and mental well-being and all those really important things that have come back into the huge priority since March for most organisations. So we're using and analysing that data on a very regular basis now. So those pulses go out literally bi-weekly to either all group functions and departments. What we'll then do on top of that is reach out to people and speak to them. So you can gather far more through a face-to-face conversation than I think that you ever could through a survey. You're able to bring out that rich data, those rich conversations and insights you just wouldn't get on an electronic platform. So we make a point of speaking to our people on quite a regular basis. And we identify them through lots of different mechanisms, of course, but that interaction is really key for us too.
And I would imagine sort of over time, a lot of organisations, and you've mentioned it as well, Centrica, have lots of knowledge on their HR portals, intranet. People will be looking at that. We could even start doing ratings on that. I mean, you go and you look at, information that's available externally. If you're buying a product, people rate all the products and all of that. So there's no reason why we couldn't even start rating knowledge articles. Some organisations do that. I think the quality of the conversation measure is a really, really interesting one. So that links back to that line manager piece as well. And if we are focusing over time as an HR function around developing more products in an agile fashion, so that iterative approach to development, or maybe we could even start measuring how quickly we get those to market, so to speak, i.e. how efficient are our ways of working, as much as also then some of the transaction elements of volumes, etc. Because you do need both, because clearly the volumetric information might be telling you something that adds underlying information to a qualitative piece of feedback from your ENPS, for example. But I think really what's interesting for me is how we start to form those feedback loops and how that becomes continuous, how we build that as part of our DNA. Do we create experience forums that are a mix of the persona groups, for example, how often we get them together, but also, again, managing expectations, because clearly that's important, as we said earlier on. So it's got to be two-way, though. Sorry, Luke, I didn't mean to cut over you, but I think we've talked so much so far about what we will give to the business, but actually it's a two-way thing. So it's part of the value proposition, the deal, or it's a partnership. Yes. So I think for me, there's also an element of how we manage that expectation as well, because the past few months with COVID, expectations of employees of their employers are changing. They're wanting more stability, they're wanting more support, sometimes even financial guidance, all that type of thing. I don't see that necessarily changing. But again, it's what do we therefore expect back in return, and how can we create that balance, I think is an interesting question to think about.
100%. I think more so now than ever before, that employee deal, we call it the employee deal, the EVP, I guess, for most organisations. The give and the get, and that transparency and clarity on what you give as an organisation in the new world, but then what you expect back from your people is so critical right now. Back to, we've already discussed the importance of honesty and transparency in the communications. But I think, reality is, for a lot of organisations, they're still finding their feet. So let's be honest, COVID's turned the world upside down for most organisations, and unfortunately, some organisations have just disappeared completely. So we're still defining, in lots of cases, as a HR function and as businesses overall, what that EVP looks like. And that's okay. That's fine. It's still, that's a learning process. But what I'm saying is, it should be done in collaboration with colleagues and employees to ensure that you've got the best culture going forward, that where you can achieve employee retention in a culture where employees want to be productive and give more. That employee experience plays a critical role in bringing that to life.
Yeah, it's interesting, Luca. You talked about collaboration with colleagues, and clearly we've talked about feedback loops and other things. We may come back to that topic as well. So it's a key part of this. But how much of the employee experience is also a collaboration between HR and other functions? How much are you engaging with other parts of your business?
Yeah, a lot. And that's a really good point, because I think it's typically HR works in quite a silo, and we've seen, and that's just been completely smashed to pieces through COVID. We've had to engage with other functions in the organisation. We've had to work with our with our partners in finance and procurement, etc. And you know, a really good example of that is actually our approach, the central approach to how we think about re-entering some of our offices post-COVID in a COVID-safe environment. So, you know, making them as safe as possible, and that sort of work package has been driven by 3 key work streams, and one of them is procurement facilities management. The other one is resilience for governance, and then the third work stream has been employee experience. So, you know, we've had to engage with all of our different partners across the business to bring the EX forefront, because now there is a recognition that whatever we do going forward has to be done through the lens of our employees. And our EX work stream has contained within it health and safety, well-being, learning and development, you know, communications, resourcing, diversity, etc., etc. So what we're seeing now is that EX is becoming the glue, you know, that's pulling together HR in a way where we can now effectively coordinate and work with partners outside of our own function.
I'm just thinking, Luca, perhaps before we then open to maybe a few final Q&A, sort of to summarise, I guess, in your advice, would you give 3 top tips around thinking about how you digitise employee experience? So for our listeners and those on the webinar, you know, what would those 3 top tips be?
Just 3. It's going to be a challenge in itself.
Well, you can have 5 if you want, as many as you want. Don't worry.
Okay, so look, I can't get it across enough that the EX cannot be, and I've said it so many times, sir, but just as a final pointer, EX has to be done in collaboration with employees. So whether you use something like the 4D methodology, which we've done to great effect at Centrica, you know, discover, define, develop, and deploy, or if you have your own methodology, use it, but use the employee voice to drive it, to help you design what your digital solutions look like. Don't fall into the trap of buying an off-the-shelf solution that you think is what your organization needs without engaging with your people first, because you can save yourself a lot of time, money, and heartache with your colleagues if you engage with them at the start of that journey. Yeah, put yourself in the shoes of your colleagues. So wherever possible, journey map what your challenge is from start to finish. You know, what's driving the problem in the first place, and what's your desired outcome? What does an entire journey look like, and who do you need to engage to make that journey the best possible experience for your people that you can? And I guess finally, simplicity and ease. You know, we all want to work in an environment that's easy to interact with, where we get what we need with as little effort as possible. Going back to our earlier discussion point around how the external market, how us as consumers are working and procuring externally. Think of HR as a business within a business. That mindset shift of HR leaders is quite, I appreciate it's quite a big step. But the sooner that we, as HR professionals, start to think of ourselves as businesses within an organisation, the better our service offering will eventually be. And obviously, the ultimate game end for employee experience is to enable a better customer experience. Let's not forget that. The better our employee experience will be, and we've got research to show this and prove this, typically the better customer outcomes are at the end of whatever you're doing, whether you're selling a product, service, whatever. Yeah. You know, Richard Branson's always been the big advocate of this within Virgin, I guess. You know, happier colleagues leads to happier customers.
Yeah,
I think that's more than 3, but yeah.
More than 3 is good.
it's really interesting to hear you talk about them, Luca, because I think there's a couple that really pick up for me. One is the journey mapping, and when I carry out journey mapping with a client, we try not just map the process steps and the perspective, but also the kind of emotional journey someone's going through as they connect through that exercise. And I think one of the things I've always taken away as a waypoint from is sometimes you just can't make it a better process. There is going to be frustration in the process, right? It might be you're waiting on an external body to do some background checking or something. But in having that dialogue and recognizing that you can do the best you can to mitigate it, to communicate it, to get people prepared, to do the expectation management, and by its very nature then improve the experience.
Agreed. Yeah. You can't always massively improve and not, you can't always massively improve things, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But to your point, as long as you're honest and open about that, and you've got the engagement throughout the process, you can mitigate the negativity at the end of the journey. But yeah, so much value in journey mapping. I couldn't stress it enough.
Yeah. And I thought the other one that really resonated with me was, you said it right at the start, and that was about simplicity as one of your principles. And for me, I think removing the noise in the process is key.
Yeah.
You talked about personas and line managers doing recruitment for the once or twice a year. And I always remember we rolled out some finance transformation work with a client on Workday, and one of the biggest challenges there was just the amount of noise that was hitting people that was irrelevant to what they actually were wanting to do as they were engaging. And by taking that, just simply taking that out, it made it such a better experience.
Yeah.
So less is more.
Because we live and we breathe it as HR professionals all the time. We kind of forget that, you know, a line manager in the Outer Hebrides might not be recruiting on a regular basis, and would only interact with the key process once or twice a year. So let's make it as simple as possible, as easy as possible. Like you say, Aaron, cut out the noise, cut out what's not necessary, and you know, yeah, I guess that's it really. That's the key takeaway, isn't it? You know.
Exactly. And I think we had a couple of questions come up on the chat. We've covered most of them, I think, as we've gone through, in particular around feedback and other pieces. I just wanted to pick up on the one that came up around technology, because you mentioned Workday clearly as a core, and you had that milestone of putting all the functionality in, and that's quite unusual for a lot of people to have one system, which is, you know, a fantastic base for you to operate on. But you also talked about the use of things like your web pages and portal and that side of thing to engage people through knowledge. But also Qualtrics as your major sort of sentiment analysis and piece.
Yeah.
Are there any other tools in your toolkit that people need to be aware of or think about?
In terms of tech, no. We've actually, I think we started off in a place where we had dozens and dozens of tools in our toolkit, and it was just too big, and it led to enormous amounts of confusion, ambiguity. So over the past 2 to 3 years, I think it's very safe to say that we've actually tried to whittle that toolkit right down. So we're ending up with systems that you could count on one hand. You know, Workday does all of our people processes, etc. We do use Qualtrics, but we are also exploring Workday surveys going forward, so that we can start to effectively measure what, you know, those key moments that matter that sit within Workday as self-serve. What do they look and what do they feel like after you've interacted with them at that moment? So, say for example, you come back off a paternity or maternity process, you've had to complete your Workday stuff. We'll measure that satisfaction there and then. So we're trying to explore how we can get in at the moment in time feedback. I mean, we've used all sorts of things in the past, from SurveyMonkey to God knows what else, you know, but our mantra is simplicity now. So let's try and whittle them all down to a handful of mechanisms that we use. You know, it's a better experience for employees also, rather than receiving surveys and questions with lots of different platforms.
Yeah, I think it's a great example of taking some of that noise out that we were talking about. It's just even the system simplification, right, in terms of getting that down to just a few ways of engaging.
Yeah,
we had a question come up from Agnieszka, I think, asking about some specifics around some of the sort of simplification of processes and what some of the things that have been taken out to make things easier for people to understand. There's a couple in my head, and I'll just share those and then see if there's any others you'd like to add. One is on the HR side was that piece about recruitment, which is don't tell a line manager what everybody else is doing in the process. Just tell them the 3 or 4 steps they have to do, right? And so it's very clear. Whereas I think traditionally a lot of people communicate the whole process, right? They want everyone to really understand their process. They're really proud of it and get that across. But keep it to just the pieces people are doing. And then I was reflecting on a piece of work we did rolling out finance and the noise there, and that was things like expense, even simple expense lists, expense codes, which is like one of the biggest touch points for employees into there. And we had one client who, rather than helping the client through the system or the colleague through the system navigate to the right expense code just gave them a list of 500 codes to choose from. And so their experience was, here's the full list for you to choose from. Whereas actually what would have been easier would be the extra step of going, no, here are the top 10 you would always use, and narrowing it down and making it much simpler. So sometimes it's about what people see and what they engage with as much as it is about the process.
It is. You're completely right. Look, just to touch on the first point you made about recruitment, one of the exercises that we actually did, it was about 2018, at the start of 2018, that was a simplifying employee experience. It's a targeted piece of work, and we actually specifically looked at the recruitment process, from talent acquisition and how employees are attracted to the organisation, what their onboarding looks like, those first very influential initial experiences within the organisation. And we kind of did a lot of the similar stuff that we've spoken about already on this session today, around using those personas to process map all the interaction points and everyone that was involved in those interaction points. And then through colleague interaction, how could we simplify? Where could we remove duplication? Where could we make a specific touch point easier for you? And the end result was actually a far swifter process for all of our personas, with less complication and ambiguity. So yeah, it comes back to almost journey mapping, but with the added with the necessity to involve employees and persona types in the discussion.
Yeah.
One, maybe to fit that on its head, sort of one thought that has just sort of crossed my mind as we've been reflecting is, absolutely agree, take the noise out. But sometimes we're too silent. Sometimes actually that's even more frustrating than there being loads of noise in the process. It's, well, I've requested something, either it's I'm trying to do a transaction or I've got a question, I just don't hear from you. You know, a new joiner, for example, who's ready to join your organisation might have a notice period that's relatively long, depending, you know, on where they're working right now. They might not hear from their new organisation for weeks. So it's absolutely agree the noise, but also there's sometimes that silence piece. Silence isn't always golden in these journeys. So yeah. I think maybe if we any sort of final questions, maybe Aaron. I think there was one around our perspectives on is experience a buzzword. I think that might fade.
I'll tell you what, I'll just jump in for that on the last one, and I'll ask. Please. I'm going to ask all three of you, because then that way Aaron doesn't get to ask just the two of you and not have his own opinion in there. So this has come from John. So he did say, do the panel think there's a risk of EX, employee experience, becoming the new jargon and therefore overused and abused, similar to how digital, agile and pivot have become recently? And I will confess, I think I've used the word pivot a little bit too much, and from this day forward I shall not be using it with as much abundance. So Luca, do you want to kick us off as our guest?
Thank you. So I think I agree with John's initial observations that I think over the past few years, EX has somewhat struggled in the HR realms to find its identity, and for organisations to really get to grips with what it means. You know, what does EX truly mean? And 100% agree. Lots of people have struggled with that. But I think when we look at organisations who have done EX and have done it really, really well, they've been able to quite clearly use it to the benefit of not just the HR function, but all group functions and colleagues at the end of the day, and then are able to translate a positive shift in EX to better customer outcomes, whether they're profit or customer retention numbers. So those are the organisations where I always take inspiration from and say, well, that's nirvana. But I think EX is evolving, and I think COVID has actually really helped employee experience in many respects to find its true meaning and significance in how HR has had to evolve because of COVID. Because I use my sort of example from earlier on, which says that, you know, I think EX is evolving into more colleague experience, but actually workplace experience, because I don't think any of us truly know what the future working life looks like for all of us. Many organisations are looking at how they use their offices. going forward? Are they going to need all their offices going forward? Or are we going to be in more collaborative spaces? And I hear that all the time in the marketplace and my network. So EX 100% has a huge role to play in that future thinking plan. I'm not saying HR in terms of its nuts and bolts will ever disappear. Of course, everyone still needs to be paid. There are certain things that HR will always have to do. But I have seen a huge shift in HR, especially over the past 18 plus months-ish, where employee experience has galvanized the typical centers of excellence together, like well-being, like benefits and reward, communications, etc., and helped to direct that activity. And I think that's where EX is going to go in the future. I think in summary, it's struggled to find its place, but I think in the future, more so than ever, it will have a very important role to play in how we as businesses interact and retain our employees and keep them happy.
Excellent. Ems, do you want to just close that off then?
Yeah, sure, happy to. So I would echo everything Luke has said, and I guess my summary would be, I think we do risk it becoming a bit of a buzzword and a fad if we're not clear on what it means to us in each of our organisations. We're not transparent about the journey and we don't measure it. I think that for me, that measurement piece is key. And I absolutely agree, Luca. I think it will evolve over time into something bigger, like the workplace piece, absolutely. But still, we've got to really understand what are the outcomes we're looking to achieve. You don't even have to say you're designing an employee experience. If you know what the outcome is, you design your operating model, your behaviours, your capabilities, all around that. Yeah,
absolutely.
And Aaron, just to close off before I wrap things up for today, any final thoughts?
I would say buzzword, potentially, yes. Fad, no. I think it's here to stay. I think COVID has made that happen. So I think that's how I'd summarize it, and agree fully with Emma and Luca's point, the measurement in particular, feedback loops, the critical element of this, and listening to your colleagues, listening to the other parts of your organization are key. So I think that's us, Chris.
Yeah, so to all three of you, actually, thank you very much for being part of this webinar, and thank you to everybody else that's listened today. We are just wrapping up, pretty much dead on the hour, so apologies to Mel. I'm sure she'll send me an email afterwards and say, you didn't ask my question, but what we're going to do is we'll have an FAQs section because we've just run out of time today. We will put together an FAQs document afterwards. This recording will also be uploaded onto the Lace Partners website, as I said at the start, on lacepartners.co.uk/webinars, and you'll be able to access it. You should be able to you'll get some comms as well. And we've got a newsletter going out, which should be tomorrow too, which will feature a lot of the information in it as well. So once again, thank you very much to Luca for joining us, for Emma for firing the questions, and for Aaron for chipping in here and again. And hopefully we can see you on the next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.